"You don't need to sign anything," he said. "The house is basically mine anyway. Sign here. It'll go faster if you cooperate."
You're watching True Drama Tales, bringing you original stories. Enjoy the show.
The moving truck was already backed into my driveway when I turned onto Maple Crest Lane. A man in an orange vest was carrying my grandmother's china cabinet down the ramp like it was a beat-up couch somebody was hauling out of a college dorm. And standing on my own front lawn, arms crossed, watching it happen like he was foreman on a job site, was my husband. I sat in the car for a second longer than I needed to, just looking. There was a red and white sign stuck in the grass by the mailbox. For sale. A phone number I didn't recognize. An agent's face smiling out from a little plastic sleeve. Some woman named Brenda Holt, like she'd been personally chosen to smile at me on the worst afternoon of my year so far. I got out of the car slow, the way you walk into cold water instead of jumping. "Mark?" My voice came out flatter than I expected. "What is this?" He didn't even turn around right away. That was the first thing that told me how bad it was going to be. He finished watching the movers before he looked at me, like I was the interruption and they were the main event. "We're listing the house," he said, like he was telling me the mail had come. "Listing it with who? I didn't sign anything." He finally turned. There's a look Mark gets when he's already decided he's going to win an argument before it starts. Jaw a little forward, eyes a little bored. He had that look now. "You don't need to sign anything," he said. "The house is basically mine anyway. Sign here." He held out a folder I hadn't noticed until that second, like a magician revealing the card was in his other hand the whole time. "It'll go faster if you cooperate." I looked at the folder. I looked at the movers carrying pieces of my grandmother's life out to a truck that wasn't going to my house. It was going away from it. I looked at my husband of 9 years, standing on grass I had personally reseeded 2 springs ago, telling me to sign a paper I'd never seen, for a sale I'd never agreed to, on a house I'd never once, not for one day of our marriage, thought belonged to anyone but us. "Mark," I said again, and this time my voice didn't come out flat at all. "Whose name is on that folder?" He didn't answer that. That was the second thing that told me how bad it was going to be. I want to tell you that I grabbed the folder out of his hands right then and read every word standing on the lawn while the neighbors watched. That's not what happened. What happened is I told the man in the orange vest to put the china cabinet back down, and he looked at Mark, not me, to see whose instruction actually counted around here. That's the moment that really got me. Not the truck, not the sign, the look on that stranger's face, checking with my husband to see if my word meant anything in my own driveway. It didn't, apparently. Not yet. But it was going to. To understand how a woman ends up standing in her own driveway, asking a stranger whose name is on a folder, you have to go back 9 years to a town outside Columbus, Ohio, where a girl who just buried her grandmother met a boy who was, by every outward measure, exactly what everyone told her she should want. I grew up in that house on Maple Crest. Not always. My grandmother Ruth bought it in 1987 with money she'd saved working the front desk at a dental office for 31 years. And when she passed, 3 months before I met Mark, she left it to me. Not to me and a future husband. Not to whoever I ended up marrying. To me. Ruth Ann Whitcomb, on the deed, in her own careful handwriting on the will, leaving it to her granddaughter, Emily. I met Mark at a charity 5K that spring. He wasn't running it, he was working the water table, handing out little paper cups and grinning at every woman who jogged past like she was the only one he'd handed a cup to all day. I liked that about him at first. It felt like being chosen. It took me about 4 years of marriage to understand that a man who makes every woman feel chosen isn't choosing anyone. He's just good at cups. Mark came from a family business, Carter & Sons Construction, started by his father, run for the last decade mostly by his mother, Diane, after his father passed. Mark worked there too, in operations, which meant different things depending on which year you asked him. Some years it meant he ran 3 job sites. Some years it meant he sat in an office answering emails his mother wrote for him first. Diane Carter was, from the very first Sunday dinner, the kind of woman who complimented your cooking and criticized your seasoning in the same sentence. "This is so good, honey. Did you know a pinch of sugar cuts the acid in tomato sauce? I always forget to tell people that." She said things like that for 2 years before she ever said anything unkind outright. By then, the pattern was so worn in, I almost couldn't see it anymore. That's how it works. Nobody hands you a contract on day 1 that says you will spend the next several years being slowly, politely erased. It happens 1 pinch of sugar at a time. We got married 18 months after the water table. Moved into my house, Ruth's house, together. Mark's name went on nothing because there was nothing to put it on. The deed stayed exactly the way Ruth left it. I never once thought about that fact for the next 9 years. Why would I? I trusted him. That's not a confession. That's just what marriage is supposed to be. Our wedding was small, at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, and I remember exactly 2 things clearly from that day. The first is Ruth's rocking chair, the one from the house, sitting empty at the edge of the reception under a string of lights, because I couldn't get married without some piece of her there, even though she'd been gone 4 months by then. The second is Diane, in a champagne-colored dress, pulling me aside during the first dance to tell me I looked surprisingly put together for someone who did her own hair. I laughed it off that night. I told Dana about it in the car afterward, and Dana didn't laugh at all. "Write that down somewhere," Dana said. "Not to hold on to it, just so that in 5 years, when there's 50 more just like it, you'll remember there was a first one." I didn't write it down. I wish I had, because Dana was right. There were 50 more, and then there were 200 more. And somewhere in the middle of all of them, I stopped being able to tell the difference between a compliment and a correction, because Diane had gotten so good at wearing one inside the other. 2 years ago, Mark's father died of a heart attack on a job site in July, and within 6 weeks, Diane had moved into our guest room, just until I figure out my next move. Her next move took 26 months and counting. That's the part people always want to skip past when they tell this kind of story. The part where the mother-in-law arrives with 2 suitcases and a grief nobody wants to argue with. And slowly, room by room, opinion by opinion, she starts running your household from the guest bed. I let her because she just lost her husband and because Mark begged me to. And because I told myself 2 years wasn't that long in the scheme of a whole marriage. 2 years. Long enough to learn exactly which cabinet Diane liked her mugs in. Long enough that I started putting them there myself before she even had to say anything. The business, meanwhile, was quietly falling apart. I didn't know that yet. Nobody told me that yet. What I knew was that Mark had started coming home later, that his phone had started living face down on every surface he set it on, and that whenever I asked how work was going, he gave me the same 3 words in a row, like they were a locked door. Fine. It's fine. I believed him. That's the part I still have trouble forgiving myself for. Not that I was lied to, but that I made it so easy. There were other signs, if I'm honest. Small ones I filed under other explanations at the time, because those explanations were easier to live with. The HOA newsletter mentioned twice, in the same polite, passive-aggressive font the newsletter used for everything, that certain properties were behind on their landscaping contract with Carter & Sons, which I'd assumed meant a scheduling problem, not a money problem. At the neighborhood block party that August, Carol's husband Dale asked Mark, half joking, whether Carter & Sons was still bidding on the new elementary school gym addition. And Mark's laugh had come out one beat too fast, one beat too loud. The kind of laugh that's covering for something instead of responding to something funny. I noticed it. I filed it away with the rest. "He's fine," I told Dana on the phone one night that spring, before any of this had a name yet. "He's just stressed about work." "Emily..." Dana has a way of saying my name that functions as an entire follow-up question. "You've said he's just stressed about work 4 times this year. At what point does the stress get its own name?" I didn't have an answer for her then. I do now. The stress had a name. It was $81,000, and it had another woman's signature next to it in an account I'd never once been told existed. Back in the driveway, Mark finally set the folder down on the hood of the moving truck. Like he'd decided I needed a visual aid to understand a concept I clearly wasn't grasping fast enough for him. "There's a home equity loan," he said, "against the house. I took it out 8 months ago. For the business." I heard the words. I didn't understand them, not really. Not the way you understand a fact your whole body has already accepted. It was more like hearing a foreign language you technically studied in high school. The shapes of the sentences were familiar, the meaning wasn't landing. "You took out a loan?" I said slowly. "Against my house. Our house. Against my grandmother's house, Mark. Using what collateral exactly? Because your name isn't on the deed." For the first time since I'd pulled into the driveway, something flickered across his face that wasn't boredom. It was there and gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. "It's a formality," he said. "Married couples do it together all the time. You'd have signed it if I'd asked." "Then why didn't you ask?" He didn't answer that either. 2 questions now, hanging in the air over my front lawn like the smell of somebody else's cookout drifting over the fence. Close enough to notice, too far to explain. The mover in the orange vest was still standing there, china cabinet balanced on a dolly, waiting to be told which direction his afternoon was going to go. "Put it back in the house," I told him. "Please." He looked at Mark again. "Put it back in the house," Mark said. And only then did the man move. And something about that my instruction only became real once my husband repeated it, sat in my stomach like a stone I'd swallowed whole. I didn't sign anything that day. I told Mark I needed time to think, which was a lie. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I just didn't want to do it standing in front of him. I wanted to do it alone, at a desk, with documents in my hands and nobody watching my face while I read them. I went to my bank 2 days later. Not our bank, the one Mark used for the business account. The one where I'd never once needed to ask questions because I'd never once had a reason to doubt anything that came out of it. The loan officer, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Whitfield, who'd processed our original mortgage refinance 6 years earlier and remembered my name without checking his screen, pulled up the file without hesitation. He had no reason to think I wasn't supposed to see it. I was, after all, a cosigner. Except I wasn't. I was a signature, just not one I'd ever made. "Mrs. Carter," he said, turning the monitor toward me, "everything on here looks in order. Both signatures dated back in March." I looked at my own name, written in a hand that curved the E the wrong way, that I have never once curved that way in 33 years of writing my own name. I've signed thousands of documents in my life. I know exactly what my signature looks like when I'm tired, when I'm rushing, when I'm signing 40 copies of the same permission slip for a classroom of 8-year-olds back when I still taught 3rd grade. It never once, not on my worst day, curved the E like that. That's not my signature, I said. Gerald Whitfield's face did the thing faces do when they realize the floor they're standing on isn't the floor they thought it was. "I'm gonna need you to say that again," he said. "Somewhere official." I didn't go straight home. I sat in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, not driving anywhere, just breathing the way you breathe when you've been holding it without noticing. Forgery. That was the word Gerald had used. Quiet, careful, like he was handling something sharp. He'd told me what my options were: a fraud affidavit, a formal dispute, a conversation with a lawyer sooner rather than later. And every word had landed on me like a separate small stone, until I felt like I was carrying a whole riverbed home in my chest. When I finally pulled onto Maple Crest, the moving truck was gone. The for sale sign was still stuck in the grass, mocking me in red and white. And on my porch, tucked half under the welcome mat where I'd have missed it if the wind hadn't lifted one corner, was a plain white envelope with my name written on it in handwriting I knew instantly, because I'd been looking at Diane Carter's grocery lists for 2 years. "Emily, check the account ending in 4471. Don't ask him about it directly yet." I stood on my own porch, holding a note from my mother-in-law like it was a live wire, trying to decide whether I was holding a warning or a trap. Here is the thing you have to understand about how I'd been thinking about Diane for 2 years. In my head, she was the villain of this story. She was the woman who moved in for a few weeks and stayed for 2 years. She was the one who reorganized my spice cabinet without asking. She was the one who told me 6 months in that I mothered Mark a little too hard sometimes, when what she meant was that I expected him to do dishes. Every instinct I had built up over 2 years told me this note was a piece of the trap, not a way out of it. But instincts built on 2 years of small resentments don't always know what they're looking at. Account ending in 4471 wasn't a name I recognized from any statement I'd ever seen. It took me one more visit to Gerald Whitfield, one more careful conversation, and a printout he technically wasn't supposed to hand a non-account holder, but did anyway, quietly. Because by then he'd started looking at me the way you look at someone standing in water that's rising faster than she realizes. The loan money. Every dollar of the $81,000 pulled against my grandmother's house hadn't gone to Carter & Sons Construction. It had gone, in 4 separate transfers over 5 months, into a joint account. A joint account that wasn't mine. The other name on it was J. Monroe. Jessica Monroe. I knew that name. Jessica did the books for Carter & Sons. I'd met her exactly twice, both times at the company holiday party. Both times she'd shaken my hand with a smile that I now understood, looking back, had never once reached past her mouth. I sat in my car outside the bank for the second time in a week and didn't cry. I want that on the record, because everyone assumes that's the part where a woman cries. I didn't. Something colder happened instead. Something settled into place, quiet and permanent, the way concrete does once you stop watching it and come back the next day to find it's become a different kind of solid than it was the night before. 8 months, I thought. 8 months of fine, it's fine, and a phone that lived face down on every table in our house. Not angry yet. Not exactly. Something underneath anger? Something that doesn't have a good word in English. The closest I can get is this. The feeling of finally understanding a joke that's been going on around you for months and realizing you were the punchline the whole time. I didn't confront Mark first. I confronted Diane because she was the one who'd left the note, and because for the first time in 2 years, I actually wanted to sit down across a table from her. She was in the kitchen when I got home, doing something to a pot roast that didn't need doing, the way she always found something to do with her hands when she wanted to look busy instead of nervous. "You found the account," she said. Not a question. "You knew," I said. "How long have you known?" Diane turned the burner down before she answered, which told me she'd rehearsed this moment, or at least braced for it, more than once. 3 months, she said. "I found a statement in his truck when I was looking for the registration. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you without you thinking I was the one who did something to you." Why would I think that? She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face, I want to say it softened, but that's not quite it. It got more honest. Like she'd been holding a certain expression in place for 2 years, the way you hold your stomach in at a pool party, and she'd finally, quietly let it go. "Because I know exactly how I've looked to you since I moved in here," she said. "I know what kind of woman you think I am, and I let you think it because it was easier than explaining the kind of woman I actually am." She sat down across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table Mark had put his folder on top of just days before, and told me something I didn't expect. "My husband did this to me too," she said. "Not the money, the other part. There was a woman at the company 20 years ago when Mark was still in middle school. I found out the way you found out." A statement I wasn't supposed to see. I stayed anyway because I had a 12-year-old and no degree and a mother who'd have told me I made my bed. I stayed and I got quieter every year after that. And I told myself quiet was the same thing as strong. She looked down at her hands. I watched my son grow up and marry a woman who reminded me of who I used to be before I got quiet. And I watched him start doing exactly what his father did. And I thought, no, not again. Not to her, too. I sat with that for a second. It didn't erase 2 years of pinch of sugar comments and reorganized spice cabinets. It did something else, something harder to explain. It moved her in my head from one column into a different one. Not innocent. Nobody in this story gets to be simply innocent. But not the villain I'd built her into either. Just a woman who'd spent 20 years being quiet, watching her son learn the wrong lesson from his father, and trying, clumsily, 3 months too late, one anonymous note under a doormat, to keep me from spending 20 years being quiet too. Not again, I could see her thinking, sitting there with her hands still. Not this time. Not to her too. "There's something else," Diane said, and reached into her cardigan pocket and set a small folded piece of paper on the table between us, like she was laying down a card she'd been holding for a long time. "What's this?" "Call your grandmother's lawyer," she said, "the one who handled her estate. Ask him what a life estate with reversionary trust means. Ask him whether a loan against that kind of deed is even legally possible without the trustee's signature." I stared at her. "How do you know anything about my grandmother's estate?" "Because your grandmother and I went to the same church for 11 years before she passed," Diane said. "And because 2 months ago, when I started putting pieces together, I called her lawyer myself and asked him a question I had no business asking. He wouldn't tell me anything, but he did say one thing before he hung up on me. He said, 'Whoever's been signing things on that property better hope Emily finds out before the bank does.'" I sat very still. "Mark doesn't know," Diane said, "about the trust. I don't think he's ever once read that will all the way through." "He assumes it's a normal deed, because that's what men like Mark assume. that paperwork is boring, and boring things don't matter, right up until they're the only thing that matters. Frank Delaney had handled my grandmother's estate 11 years earlier, back when he had more hair and I had less reason to ever need his services again. His office hadn't changed. Same wood-paneled walls, same brass lamp that looked older than both of us combined. What had changed was the file he pulled out when I told him why I'd come. "Your grandmother," he said, "was sharper than most attorneys I've worked with in 40 years. He said it with something close to pride, like he was talking about a colleague instead of a client. She didn't leave you a house, Emily. Not in the way most people mean that. She left you a life estate, full rights to live in it, sell it, do anything you want with it for the rest of your life. But it's held inside a small trust she set up specifically so that no future spouse could ever put a claim on it without your direct, notarized, witnessed authorization. Not a joint signature, not implied consent. Your signature in this office with me in the room." "Why would she do that?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "Because your grandfather did something similar to her back in 1974. Different circumstances, same shape. She told me once, I remember this clearly because it's not the kind of thing you forget a client saying. She told me, 'I'm not leaving my granddaughter a house. I'm leaving her a door that only she can lock.' I thought about the way my grandmother used to hum while she watered her tomato plants, completely unbothered by anything, and realized for the first time that the calm I'd always admired in her hadn't been the absence of a storm. It had been a woman who'd already survived one and built herself a door because of it." "So, the loan?" I said slowly. "The loan is invalid," Frank said. "It never should have been processed in the first place. The bank made an error not catching the trust designation, which is a separate problem they're going to have to answer for. But more immediately, Emily, that signature on the loan application isn't just not yours. It's a signature that legally couldn't have authorized this loan even if it had been. Which means your husband didn't just forge your name. He forged it on a document that was fraudulent by design from the moment it was submitted." He closed the file and looked at me over his glasses. "You are, and I want to be very clear about this, holding every part in this situation. Every single one." I drove home that afternoon with the folder Frank had prepared sitting on the passenger seat like a second person in the car. Every red light felt longer than usual. Every mile marker felt like it was counting down to something instead of just marking distance. 11 years, I thought at one point, stopped at an intersection I'd driven through 1,000 times without noticing it. 11 years since Ruth passed, and she was still protecting me. She built the door before she even knew who I'd need protecting from. I didn't cry then either. I laughed, actually. Once, short and a little wild, right there at the red light. Because it was either that or something worse. And laughing felt like the version of this feeling I could survive driving through. I called Dana that night. Dana's been my best friend since we were 19, and she talked me out of a haircut that would have ruined my entire sophomore year. And she has never once, in 14 years of friendship, let me sit alone with bad news for longer than it takes her to grab her keys. She showed up in 20 minutes with a bottle of wine she didn't open, because she took one look at my face and decided this was a night for clear heads instead. "Okay," she said, sitting down across from me at the table that had seen entirely too much that week. "Walk me through it again, slowly, and don't leave out the part where you drop this on him." I told her everything. The loan, Jessica Monroe, the account, Diane's note, Frank's office, the door only I could lock. Dana listened the way she always listens. completely still, no interrupting, just her jaw getting tighter with every new piece. "There's one more thing," she said when I finished. "You need Carol." "Carol from across the street?" "Carol from across the street has a doorbell camera pointed directly at your driveway, and a nephew in IT who set up her cloud storage to keep 90 days of footage instead of the standard 30, because, and I quote, you never know what the neighborhood's gonna do. Emily, Carol has been dying for a reason to be useful for 3 years." Carol Higgins answered her door in a bathrobe covered in cardinals, holding a mug that said "World's Okayest Grandma," and did not seem even slightly surprised to see us. "I wondered when you'd come ask," she said, and waved us inside before I'd said a single word about why we were there. It turned out Carol had seen more than she'd ever mentioned, because, her words, "It wasn't my business to mention it, but it's absolutely my business to keep it, in case it ever became my business." She pulled up footage from her phone at the kitchen table like she'd been organizing an exhibit, dates stamped in the corner of every clip. A silver sedan, not Mark's truck, parked in our driveway on 4 separate afternoons over the past 2 months, always between 1 and 3, always while I was still at work. A woman getting out, dark hair, sunglasses, a blazer I recognized from the holiday party. Walking straight to the front door with the kind of familiarity that only comes from having a key. "That's Jessica Monroe," I said quietly, watching myself say it like the words belonged to someone else. "I don't know her name, honey," Carol said. "I just know she's not you." The last clip was from 6 days ago, the two of them on the porch, Mark handing her something, an envelope, thick enough to be papers, not cash. His hand on her arm for 1 second longer than a coworker's hand should stay on anyone's arm. Not our marriage falling apart in one dramatic scene. Just a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary as laundry, filmed by a doorbell camera because a nephew in IT thought, you never know what the neighborhood's gonna do. You never do. I didn't scream at him. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect the woman in this kind of story to scream, and I understand why, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't want to. But I'd spent a week collecting a door only I could lock, and a door doesn't slam itself open. You close it, quiet, and final, and you make sure everyone standing on the wrong side of it understands exactly why. I set 3 things on the kitchen table on a Thursday evening. Frank's folder, Gerald's printout, and my laptop open to the first frame of Carol's footage. Mark came in from work, dropped his keys in the bowl by the door the way he'd done every single day for 9 years, and saw the table before he saw my face. He went very still. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I watched him read. I watched the particular way a person's shoulders change when they realize the story they've been telling themselves for months is about to stop being the only version anyone believes. He got to Frank's letter about the trust, about the door only I could lock, and something in his jaw moved once, like a muscle remembering an old injury. "Emily," he started. "Don't," I said. "Not yet. I want you to finish reading first." He finished. It took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the stove the whole time, the way you watch a pot you already know is going to boil, just to have somewhere to put your eyes that wasn't his face. When he looked up, he didn't apologize. That's the detail I remember most clearly, more than anything he actually said. 9 years of marriage, an $81,000 forged loan, an affair with his own bookkeeper, and the very first words out of his mouth were not, "I'm sorry." They were, "How much does your mother know?" Not, "What have I done to you?" Not, "How do we fix this?" How much does your mother know? Like the discovery of a felony was in his mind mostly a public relations problem, and I was mostly the department in charge of containing it. Something settled in me the rest of the way then. Not rage, Something quieter and more useful than rage. She knows all of it, I said. She's known for 3 months. She's the one who told me where to look. I watched that land on him too. The understanding that his own mother had chosen me over the story he'd been telling himself he could keep managing forever. I already talked to a lawyer, he said, and there it was, that jaw-forward look from the driveway, trying to walk back onto solid ground even though the ground under this particular sentence had already given out. You're not getting the house. It's marital property. Any lawyer will tell you that. Frank Delaney already told me the opposite, I said, in writing. Would you like his number? Or would you like to hear it from me, since apparently how much my mother-in-law knows was your priority, not whether you'd committed a felony against your own wife? He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't have made it worse. Here's what a felony forgery accusation actually buys you, in case you're ever unfortunate enough to need to know. It buys you leverage, and leverage, it turns out, moves faster than love ever did in our marriage. Within a week, with Frank's guidance, I filed the fraud affidavit with the bank, which opened its own internal investigation into how the loan had been approved in the first place. Gerald Whitfield later told me, off the record, that 2 people in that branch's underwriting department were placed on leave over it. The loan was voided. The lien against my grandmother's house, my door, my lock, was released within 9 days. Mark didn't fight the divorce filing once his own lawyer read the same documents I'd already shown him, and quietly, carefully, explained to his client exactly how much worse a courtroom would make things. A man who forges his wife's signature to fund an affair with his company's bookkeeper does not, it turns out, come out looking sympathetic in front of a judge. Mark signed the papers 3 weeks later at Frank's office, in the same wood-paneled room where my grandmother once decided to build a woman a door. He didn't look at me while he signed. I don't know if that was shame or something smaller than shame. I've stopped trying to guess what goes on behind that particular jaw. Jessica Monroe lost her position at Carter & Sons within the month, not because Diane fired her out of loyalty to me, though I think she'd have been happy to, but because an internal audit into where $81,000 of business money had actually gone tends to end careers on its own, without anyone needing to add extra pressure. I found out one more thing during that audit, from the accountant Diane brought in, a tired, precise woman named Priya, who clearly wasn't being paid enough to referee a family this messy. Jessica hadn't started the account. Mark had, and Mark had put her name on it after the fact, telling her, according to a string of texts Priya found while tracing the transfers, that it needed 2 names for tax reasons, and that if she didn't cooperate, he'd make sure she never worked bookkeeping in this county again. Whether that was true or just Mark being Mark, I don't know. What I do know is that Jessica sent me one email 3 weeks after everything came out. 4 lines long, no excuses in it, just an apology and an admission that she'd known it was wrong and done it anyway, because she was scared and, in her words, tired of being the only person in that office who ever said no to him and watched it cost me something. I didn't write back, but I didn't delete it either. Some people in this story get to be simply villains. She wasn't quite that, and pretending otherwise would have made the real one look smaller than he was. I heard, secondhand, through the kind of small-town channel that never quite dries up, that she moved to Columbus for a fresh start. I hope, honestly, that she gets one. I've decided I don't have room in my life to keep hating a woman I met exactly twice at a holiday party. There's only one person in this story I have room to be angry at, and he's the one whose keys used to land in that bowl by my door. Diane didn't move out right away. We had one long conversation first, at that same kitchen table, where she told me she understood if I wanted her gone by the end of the month. And I told her, a little to my own surprise, that I didn't. Not yet. Not because I'd forgotten 2 years of pinch of sugar comments, but because a woman who'd spent 20 years being quiet had finally, at real cost to herself, stopped being quiet at exactly the moment it mattered most. That earned something. Not a clean slate, just a little more time at the table. She moved into her own apartment 4 months later, a small one-bedroom near the church she'd gone to with my grandmother for 11 years, and she picked out her own mugs for her own cabinets. And when she left, she hugged me on the porch for a long time and said, "I should have said something the day I moved in. I'm sorry it took me 2 years and a folder to find my own voice again." "You found it in time," I told her. "That's the part that matters." I want to tell you the last image because it's the one I still think about more than any of the others. 3 weeks after the divorce was final, a locksmith came to change the front door lock on Maplecrest. Not because the old one was broken, but because I wanted, for reasons that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with something I needed to feel in my own hands. A door that had never once been touched by a key that wasn't mine. He handed me a small brass key, still warm from being cut, and I stood on the porch and looked at it, the way you look at something you've been waiting years to be handed, without knowing it. One key. Only mine. I thought about my grandmother, humming over her tomato plants, carrying a grief from 1974 that she never once talked about out loud, and turning it, decades later, into a door instead of a wound, so that the granddaughter she raised and loved right up until the end would have somewhere that couldn't be taken from her by anyone holding the right kind of confidence and the wrong kind of folder. Carol waved from across the street while I stood there. Dana texted a single word, "Finally," like she'd been waiting on this exact moment as long as I had. And somewhere across town, in an apartment with her own mugs in her own cabinets, Diane Carter was probably, for the first time in 20 years, not quiet about something that mattered, and not sorry for it either. I never did find out exactly when Mark decided the money mattered more than the marriage. I never asked, and he never offered. Some things you just let stay unanswered, because chasing every answer isn't the same thing as healing, and I'd already spent enough of my life waiting for him to explain himself. Carter & Sons is still operating, technically, though it's Diane's company now in every way that matters. And the last I heard, Mark had taken a job managing a rental car counter 2 towns over, which is either irony or justice, and I've stopped needing to decide which. He tried calling me once, about 4 months after the divorce, late on a Friday night, the kind of hour that only ever means one of 2 things. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. I think, in the end, even he understood there wasn't a version of that message that was gonna work. Ruth's rocking chair is back on the porch now, the same one that sat empty at the edge of my wedding under a string of lights. I moved it out there myself, the same weekend the locksmith came. And some evenings, I sit in it with a cup of coffee and watch Carol water her hydrangeas across the street. And think about how strange it is that the 2 women who ended up protecting me most in this whole mess were a grandmother who died before any of it started and a mother-in-law I spent 2 years quietly resenting for reasons that, looking back, were mostly about pinches of sugar and almost never about anything that actually mattered. They say a house is just 4 walls and a roof. They say blood runs thicker than water. And they say the deed with your name on it, the one nobody else can touch without your key in your hand, is worth more than every promise a man ever whispered across a kitchen counter. You decide if that's true.